Eliot Pepper, how are you, sir?
I'm doing very well. It's good to be here.
Thank you for being here. I have to say I just finished reading your book, Foundry, and I found it to be absolutely amazing, gripping, and it was a book that did not feel long for its length, and
Hmm.
I just finished it in two sittings, and it was awesome. And I wanted to talk to you about the style of fiction that you write and the
Hmm.
path that you took to making these works of art and everything that you've stumbled upon along the way. So why don't we
Hmm.
start with, now I interface with your work for the first time where it's in its 11th iteration, and I
Hmm.
can tell that the machine is incredibly well oiled, that the pacing is, you can tell the reps that have gone into it. Why don't we
Hmm.
go back to the beginning and the first
Hmm.
one and say, okay, what is on your mind at the time where you're thinking about writing fiction for the first time?
It's funny. Foundry was my 11th novel, but it still feels like you need to learn to write every novel for the first time. That sort of like each beast is a different one to grapple with, and so uh, it's reassuring to hear that from a reader that it feels like the reps have gone in. But the irony for me as a writer is that maybe I take the lessons I've learned for granted, but it always feels like I'm trying to forge a new path and sort of like hacking through undergrowth along the way. But taking you back to my very first novel, um, I've always this continues to this day, but when I started writing my first novel, I was always thinking of myself as a reader first and a writer second. So I've always just loved story. I remember when my mom would read to me as a child, I would just get completely lost. Like if our sort of present moment, if wherever you are right now listening to us, uh, have this conversation, that's your here and now, right? Like there's the physical environment you happen to be in at the moment, and then there's elsewhere, right? And elsewhere might be looking through the screen of your phone. It might be reading a novel. It might be listening to a story. And I always would immediately get lost elsewhere whenever story came into the picture. So I've always just loved reading. I've loved books and I've loved stories. And I had an idea for a story that I wanted to read, right? Almost like, um, you know, sometimes you're like, oh, where should we go out to dinner tonight? And you're in the mood for Thai food or whatever it is. I had that feeling that like, oh, I'm in the mood for this kind of a story, and I couldn't find any books, despite trying quite actively, that scratched the itch I was going for. And so I just decided, you know what? If if I can't find a story that scratches that itch, maybe I can just start to write one. And everything just went from there. I literally opened up a like a document, like a text editor, and started typing. And that was chapter one. And I kept going. And eventually it took the shape of a novel. And eventually that novel became a trilogy because I was having fun. But it really came and continues to come for me as a writer. It always comes from being a reader, that I'm always seeking to create the thing I want to experience myself.
No, and well, I think that there's something beautiful and also difficult about that, putting yourself in the
Mm.
consumer role first, because of the access that we have to information that is completely unprecedented. And so we get not
Mm.
only the greatest information of all time, but we get all the filters of the greatness of all time. So the standards as a
Mm.
consumer are incredibly high, I would say, compared to a world in which there's like four books, and it's they're neighborhood books as opposed to the global optima of all of history. um, and then let's get into the subject matter, because I think that's really interesting too. I think
Mm.
the settings of your stories are familiar yet new in a very compelling way. And having lived in the Bay Area for close to 13 years now, I resonate with the echo of those types
Mm.
of stories missing. So
Mm.
why don't you describe the style of the settings of your novels?
Okay, well, I actually want, before we get to that, I just want to touch briefly on the first half of what became your question, which was about,
Mm,
um, you know, making art in a world full of art,
mm,
where sort of where everyone has access to just an infinite library of anything you could want. So whether it's movies, music, books, poetry, like name any medium, any format, like there have never been in all of human history, there have never been as many people making it, like making those things or enjoying those things or having access to such a just ubiquitous archive of those things. So if that's the case, like why make new stuff, right? Like there are, there are so, like there are a million, approximately, depends how you count, but there are approximately a million new books published every year in the United States alone, right? New books, not the backlist of all the books that have come before. Those are new books coming out. So, as a writer, in that context, why bother? Like all of the stories have already been told, all the ideas have already been shared for millions of years, basically, right? So what's the point? And I think that there's actually something interesting going on here. I was just going back and forth yesterday with a friend who also happens to be a writer I love, Robin Sloan, who, if you're actually, to skip ahead, if you're interested in books that I think get the Bay Area right, Robin's novels absolutely are in that category. I love them for that. But to reverse for a moment, he pointed out that there's sort of an interesting parallel between commodity food versus like craft food. So if you think of like commodity food, like there's the extreme end of like just certain grades of rice, right, which are completely commoditized, like grains. But there's also just sort of the food that you can buy at Costco, right, or its equivalent, where basically it's at a certain price point. It's easily substitutable. Like if you get one cereal, you could get a different cereal. Like they're basically just sort of like checking a box versus craft food, which, like, one example that we, like, my wife and I happen to cook a lot with and we love is a tiny little company called Macienda. They're based in LA, and they grow and then mill and sell single origin corn from Oaxaca and nixtamalize it so it's like tortilla flour, right? So you buy it, you mix it with water and a little salt, and you make tortillas at home. And we absolutely love it. And like basically, before Macienda started doing what they were doing, there was no market for that, right? Like people weren't buying that at the grocery store. You could buy like pre-made masa at a Mexican market, but it would be very different. And basically, they created the market for it. They're a category of one. And I think
mhm,
that in a world where there's this surfeit of everything, um,
mhm,
it creates an opportunity to lean in to whatever makes your work, whether you're a writer or a musician or a programmer, who whatever, right? A cook,
mhm,
to lean into whatever makes your work weird, right?
mhm,
Because if you want the commodity content, you can get it from every social media platform where it's algorithmically curated to just give you like generic chunks. I mean, even the word
mhm,
content, right? It's like
mhm.
we're not
Yeah,
even going to
filler.
name a medium, right? Like that's
Yeah,
how
yeah,
generic it is. So like
yeah.
that's how commodified media has become. And so if you're making media, I feel like a very interesting way to go about it is to go in completely the opposite direction. Instead of seeking to win the internet for a day by by supplying a chunk of commodity media, instead to lean into whatever you're doing that makes it really, really weird, and make and market your media as craft media, right? Like make something that's
Mm.
that's very personal, very specific, very idiosyncratic. And I think that
Mm.
in a world that's full of everything, there's an opportunity for that kind of craft approach. Because then when the right person stumbles on it, it's magic, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
when the right person reads the right book at the right time, it's
Mm-hmm.
amazing. Like it just lights you up, right? And that's what's
Mm-hmm.
really special. So yeah. So sorry, but that was my digression on the first half of your question. You were asking about setting,
Yeah,
and yeah.
the specifics of what make your work unique. I think that
Mm,
I picked up many layers, but I think I
mm,
trying to extrapolate from the descriptions of the stories, it is an alternative Bay Area, but not an alternative Bay
mm.
Area to reality, an alternative to what gets portrayed by the media. Um,
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I guess like the way that I think about it when I'm writing a scene set in the Bay Area. So first of all, I grew up in the Bay Area. I grew up in Oakland. I currently live in Pacifica, which is just the other side of the bay. So I have a lot of lived experience in this weird magical place on our planet, and uh, I really am fascinated by the world. I love where I live, and I love all the weird details, the texture, like the kinds of things you hear on the street, like the graffiti, the just like the tensions and conflict that are really present, like when you're just walking around these areas, and the little, like the little discoveries. Like I don't know, there's a croissant place in I think it's in El Cerrito of all places, called Rotha
mm,
Patisserie, and they make croissants that are better than anything I've had in France, right? And it's this tiny little, it's like a couple. I think one of one of them's French, one of them's British, and it's just their passion project, and they're extraordinary. And so like you sort of like stumble upon weird things like that, or you're wandering through sort of a like area of town that's sort of falling apart, and then there's just like a beautifully maintained free little library. Like I just like paying attention to this place where I happen to live, and I think that that's what comes through in the
mm,
stories, is my curiosity and enthusiasm for literally like just like the physical exterior world that constitutes the Bay Area. I just think it's a beautiful place with a lot of idiosyncrasies that are fun to weave into stories that are set here. And I think that I've heard what you sort of said from other readers, that they've lived here, they find that some of those things really resonate. It makes them feel like, oh, this is ground, this feels real, this feels legit, right, to what it's like to live here. And I think that that's just because that's what I like, right? Like it's like I'm writing about the things I pay attention to, the things that catch my interest, and then when I'm writing a story, I want to offer those things to other people, to show
mm,
them what's special, or show them what's unique about
mm-hmm.
this little spot.
Mm-hmm. No, and it's amazing, and I think. Well, I even stretch to say that Foundry is set in the Bay Area because it bounces
Mm,
around the whole globe, but there's a Bay Area feel to it. There's like
mm,
well, maybe the subject matter hits very close to home, and
mm,
so
mm,
um, but there's a second order question there, that is, of the things that you pay attention to, and I resonate 100% with that. I think there's so
mm,
much beauty in the unexplored corners of the world, or the little chaotic parts that sum up to something that gives
mm,
order. Um, However, in aggregate or at scale, it becomes a little difficult to know how to pay the right homage to those things. And what I mean by that
mm.
is, as you're collecting these experience, what is your indexing mechanism? And this is very, yeah, I'm revealing myself as a programmer by even framing it like that. So that when you are, the blank page is before you and you're trying to, like, whip out the palette, that the right things come to mind, and that the right, I'm
Mm,
thinking of you, of stumbling through the writing process for Foundry, and you're bouncing around the world, and
mm,
then where am I going,
mm.
and what are the details that I paint there?
Such a Bay Area question. Love
I know.
it. You're really,
Can't
yeah,
help it.
you're leading in on this. Okay, so here's the way I think about this. Um, when I'm not writing, I'm often surfing, and um, I want to tell you about two different famous surfers. So, um, the first is Kelly Slater, who's probably the
Mhm.
most famous surfer of ever. He's won, I don't even know how many world championships, and he's like he must be in his 50s now, and he's like saying that he's the Michael Jordan of surfing is a discredit to Kelly Slater because he's been dominant in sort of the professional surf tour scene for way longer and way more dramatically than Jordan ever was. So
Mhm.
he's this like extraordinary athlete. Um, but even though I respect like the hell out of him as an athlete, I don't love his how he surfs. He's insanely good at everything he does. But the way I would describe his surfing is it's very fast, it's very dramatic, it's very vertical. His movements on the wave
Mhm.
are very intense. And
Mhm.
it's like for him, the wave is a place for him to do what he wants. And he's so good at that he can do anything, right? Almost give him any wave, and he's just going to like do crazy airs and turns and get barreled. He's just this monster, but it's almost like he's using it as a half pipe or as a it's
Mhm.
like it's the stage and he's the performer. So
Mhm.
that's sort of one approach to surfing. And there's another surfer far less well known named Torrin Martin who surfs very differently than Kelly Slater. When you see Torrin Martin surf, and if you like search for his name on YouTube or whatever, you can watch a clip. Even if you've never surfed before, you'll notice that every movement he makes is really smooth.
Mhm.
He's dropping into the wave at the perfect point and then smoothly transitioning up onto his board. And then he's finding the cleanest line down through the wave. So the wave is forming and he's reacting to how it's forming. His surfing is much less physical, it's much less dynamic. It's not moving around and doing these like sharp turns. He's doing these smooth, graceful movements. And basically, it's like on the wave, or every wave, there's a place the wave wants you to be all the time.
Mhm.
And he is amazing and always being in that place. And that's the kind of surfing I admire and seek to do myself when I'm in the water, is rather than saying the wave is a playground for me to do tricks on. Instead of that, I'm looking at the wave and saying, where does the wave want me to be? It's like being a
Mhm.
follower when you're dancing,
Mhm.
right? Like rather
Mhm.
than being the lead. And when I'm writing a novel, it feels the exact same way. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to find the cleanest line through the
Mhm.
story, and that is primary, that everything else falls away, right? And so when I'm composing, that's what I'm going for. So I'm always trying to ask myself, okay, maybe I had an idea of what the story was going to be. But that idea shifts as soon as you start writing the story. Just like
Mhm.
when Torin drops in on a wave, the wave changes as he's moving down it. And so he has to
Mhm.
react to that and adapt and find that cleanest line. And that's what I'm trying to do. So I always
Mhm.
have like a million ideas. I have a million cool details that could go into a story. And maybe I some of them I even feel attached to because they seem so
Mhm.
fun or so interesting or so
Yeah.
cool. But I always have to be reminding myself at every point as I'm writing and then again as I'm editing, like how do I find the cleanest line? How do I make this story exactly what it needs to be and nothing else, right?
Mhm.
Just what really needs to be there. And so that's how I select the next word, the next sentence, the next event, the next paragraph, the next chapter, the next novel to write is with that, through that lens. But I want to like insert a major caveat here, which is that beauty is manifold. Like there are so many ways to create beautiful things, right? And far more people find Kelly Slater's style of surfing compelling than they then do Torrin Martin, right? So this is not a universal prescription for how to make the thing you want to make. Like I've read and loved many novels that are not at all that, right? Like Amor Towles wrote A Gentleman of Moscow a few years ago, and I love that book, but it's meandering. It uses space. It goes on many delightful digressions. Part of the appeal of that novel is its sprawling nature. But for the things that really hit me and for the things that I want to make, I really feel the appeal of seeking the cleanest line.
No, and I think that's the thing that I noticed when reading Foundry is that it's really tight. It's very, very tight. Almost every word seems to, like you switch a word and you don't know if the whole thing's gonna. But what I was referring to something more mundane, things like capture mechanisms. Do you take photos of the the little vistas that you enjoy? Do you take notes?
No. The short answer is no. I actually think that forgetting is such a superpower that goes really underappreciated. Like there are no self-help books titled The Surprising Power of Forgetting Most of What You Experience, right? But like I actually think that filter is, at least for me, that's the only filter that matters. That and this goes for when I'm reading, when I'm researching, when I'm just like living, like if it doesn't stick with me, it wasn't meant to stick with me, and it doesn't need to go into whatever I'm writing. If it sticks with me, there's probably a reason for that, and that reason might be worth interrogating. And so I actually really just use the imperfect sieve of memory as my note-taking mechanism in that sense, or like in that sense, right? Like I don't try to capture data at all. I just try to experience things as fully as I can, and then reflect on them as I'm making something new.
No, that I've been thinking about that too, because I operate in the same way you do. But as I'm thinking of trying to, capture more things and doing it at scale, then I'm tempted by the promise of, a perfectly organized brain. But that said, I mean, like a lot of these things, they are about the impression that they cause on you. And even if you don't remember precisely the name of the cafe in Paris where the second best croissant in the world is, you would just make it up, and you kind of try and fill in the gaps that you remember from the impressions that you got.
Yeah, I mean, I like along those lines. I think I would make a terrible reporter, right? Like if you were if you were a reporter and you were going in and doing interviews and doing your research and you're reporting news stories on it, like I doubt this approach would serve your readers well. But for me, writing fiction, I actually find that to be the most effective way to assemble the material I need. So yeah, I don't think there's any wrong answer there. That just happens to be like how I go about it.
And as you mentioned fiction, why don't we talk a little bit about your jump from the previous life to writing fiction? The life of Silicon Valley, the VC, the tech universe. Why don't we talk about that transition when you had already had the novel? It manifested into this thing that you saw could become what it's become now.
Uh-huh.
Um, let's talk about that, the path that got you into the professional path that got you into writing.
Sure. So, yeah, before I wrote my first book, or let me start the other way around, go from the beginning to the end. So, basically, out of college, I started working at startups. So, I worked in a few different startups. Not all of these, people might assume that means software startups, but actually, the first company I worked for did plasma arc gasification technology. So,
Oh.
they literally made these machines that were like the size of 40-foot shipping containers with plasma chambers where you would drop trash in one side and then gasify it so that you could turn it into electricity. It was one of those things that worked great in the lab, and just they like we couldn't figure out how to make it work in the real world of like being at a dump where you have such random materials that are being thrown in all the time. It just was really technically difficult. But anyway, I worked for a few different startups, and then I got recruited into a venture capital firm where we were investing in early stage companies. And I was an entrepreneur in residence for them, which basically is like one of these catch-all terms that's sort of bullshitty, and or means very different things at different places.
Mm-hmm.
What it meant for me was that I was both working on financings, like scouting and then doing due diligence on deals, but then uh, also working as a drop-in operator for our portfolio companies. So at the very beginning of a company's life, that might mean like I was negotiating a tech transfer deal with a university so that we could like spin out a technology from their lab. Or when companies were larger, like say post Series B, like basically as a new company grows, it just means that the founders keep encountering new problems, right? Like the faster you're growing, the more successful you are, the more new problems you have to deal with. And by definition, you have not yet hired the people you need to solve those problems on your behalf. And so I was basically like my role was to drop in and be extra boots on the ground to tackle those new problems, improvise a really duct tapey solution, while we tried to fill the role with someone who actually knew what they were doing. So, like to make it specific, often when you're building a company, you have someone who's the first salesperson of the company. But just because you're good at, you might be the best salesperson in the world, that doesn't necessarily make you good at building a sales team, right? Because they're very different skills. And so, yeah, so like I might come in and like set up the structure to build out a sales team with like the marketing strategy behind it and all that. So that amazing salesperson can keep doing what they're good at while we like actually hire in a VP sales or something like that. So hopefully that gives you just sort of like a flavor for the projects I was touching. And then, the natural next step for someone who has that kind of job is you then start a company or you join the management team of a startup. So that would have been my sort of natural next step, except that I totally sabotaged that career path by writing a novel. And so I wrote the novel, the book came out, and you know, building a startup like as a founder doesn't go along easily with also writing and publishing novels on the side. It's a pretty all-consuming vocation. And so I knew that wasn't gonna that I didn't want to pretend that I could do both and do both poorly. And so instead I decided, what would I regret more 40 years from now, right? Like not publishing this book and seeing where this weird path leads, or giving it a shot. And I was like, I want to give it a shot. So I did. And now I'm here. It's sort of interesting. You said that, I think the way you framed this question was like this big like shift. And that those worlds maybe seem quite disparate, right? Like, I don't think a lot of people would associate like sort of building new technology businesses with writing literature. But I actually have found that there's way more sort of middle ground between those two, like experiences than I was necessarily expecting. Like as an like just like a cute few simple examples, it's like as any artist, you have to both make your thing, but then you also have to bring it to people who might
Hmm.
love it, right? And like that's basically like making a product and launching it, right? You have to
Hmm.
figure out how you're gonna pay for your life and getting those things into the world. That's financing, right? Like
Hmm.
like both my novels in particular, at least, and my work, building companies has really been about imagining the role the role in the feedback loop of technology in society, right? Like
Hmm.
how the culture changes as these new as people invent new things. And I just find that really fascinating. And like you can interact with that feedback loop by making new things or contributing to people who are making new things, but you can also do it by telling stories about what might happen if technology changes. So I actually found that it was sort of less of a leap than I was expecting. And I've also worked, even since the books have come out, I occasionally consult with founders on storytelling because I
Hmm.
mean, if you, yeah, I mean, if you if you're trying to recruit a team and make something new and get people on board and talk to board members, talk to the press, just like if you're on a quest, you need to know how to chronicle the quest. Otherwise, no one else is going to join, right? And so there's actually there are a lot of parallels between sort of inventing new things and trying to bring them to the world and making art and trying to bring that to the
Hmm.
world.
No, I got there too, but it was a roundabout journey for me to finally
Mm.
equate the two. I think I
Mm.
don't know why. The more introspective I am, the more I guess I just had a default distance between myself and art
Mm.
that I wouldn't necessarily overcome unless I was able to integrate both sides of the equation. But I agree. I mean,
Mm.
like this is what we're doing now. I mean, like I mean, we're talking about the process of making of something, and hopefully, like when people listen to this, they not only get inspired but also get excited enough to hear the stories themselves.
Mm.
And I feel like I'm wearing more hats than I've ever worn in my entire life. Like
Mm.
the sales and finance, and it's all every mode of cognition possible. Um, so I agree with you there, but it does feel like it. And the final thing that got to my mind that clicked was, oh, I guess I stopped writing software for machines and I started writing software for minds. And then I realized, it's basically the same idea. Um, but I'd love to deep dive about Foundry a little and about the worldview in it, because I think
Mm.
there's something really cool about the tale of the geopolitical giants, the
Mm.
giant hive minds, as expressed through the lens of two agents with
Mm.
however many layers of multi generational trauma and shifting allegiances and shifting, positions that they can take. Um, how did you decide that that was the right frame to tell the story about where the world is at?
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting because with Foundry in particular, it's been different for me with different books. But for Foundry in particular, I had a dream where I had this image of these two people in a room, and I wanted to know how they got there. They were interrogating each other at gunpoint in a hotel room, and I
Mm,
wanted to know. I couldn't remember anything from the dream. I couldn't remember the context or why they were there. All I was left with was this really like emotionally resonant image, and
mhm,
so I just started with that image. Like I wrote a couple sentences and then kept going. And so what was interesting for me about Foundry was I was we talked about finding the cleanest line earlier, and this was like I was really writing the story line by line. I didn't have an
mhm,
outline, I didn't have a plan, I didn't have a map. And so the way that sort of the bigger geopolitical ideas got woven in was almost incidental. Like it was almost to try to figure out the story of these two people. And it turned out that to understand them, you needed those ideas, right? But that's that's the reason the ideas were there. Now, that has I'll give you another example for a different book, just briefly, and then we can return to Foundry. I have a novel called Veil, and the way that Veil started was I listened to a podcast. So hopefully down the line, someone somewhere will listen to this podcast and have an equivalent story. But I listened to a podcast. It was actually Charles C. Mann being interviewed by Tyler Cohen, and he made a very brief digression. It wasn't even like the subject of the interview, where he described solar geoengineering, basically like this research where climatologists have imagined what might happen if you flew planes across the sky and basically scattered dust in the upper atmosphere, making the Earth slightly more reflective so that a little bit of sunlight reflects off of the planet, and thereby reducing global temperature, which, basically to combat the most dangerous aspects of climate change. And it turns out that like this has already happened many times. Anytime a volcano explodes, this happens because a bunch of dust gets shot up way high up in the sky. And so every time a volcano explodes for the next few years, the Earth gets a little cooler. And so scientists have been asking, well, if we're worried about the Earth getting too warm, what if we did this as a stopgap measure while we transition our energy system? And I was just like, that sounds insane. Like that is like so wild. Like really? Like this is a thing? And so I just, started reading scientific papers and talking to people in the field and learning all about it. And I knew I wanted to write a novel about it. It just felt like so many meaty questions that have no obvious answers, right? Like there's a lot of interesting mess there about human agency and sort of the Anthropocene, and like both at a personal level, at a political level, like what does it mean for people in different countries? There's just a lot there. But the problem with writing a novel about that is it's such a big idea, right? Like, how do you find your way in to that story? Like a novel is about actual people going through actual events. It's not just an idea. It's not a thought leadership piece, right? It's not like you could easily write an essay about here are the implications if you tried this. But to say, oh no, here's a particular strand. Like what if this actually happened? Like how do you find the person with the perspective that you want, or that would bring a useful perspective to a problem that big? And so I spent a lot of cycles trying to figure out who the main character would be, right? Like who is the person, or who are the people whose stories add up to something that has something meaningful to say about this kind of a thing happening. And so again, for different novels, it's been different, but trying to weave those big themes in, and it sort of like happens for different ways for me.
Yeah, and I can see how there's the top down, bottom up approach, right? Where all of a sudden you start to see how the layers of meaning stack on each other and harmonize in beautiful ways. Like the implications of an immigrant identity with the implications of the geopolitical state of the world and an empire and things of this sort. I think. But there's also the other way around, which I think is, like I want to write a book about the I don't know, some incredibly impossible thing like the death of God or something like that. And, like where do you even begin writing that story? Seems to be really crazy. But I think that, well, first of all, I would just have to say the characters in Foundry are incredibly compelling. And the protagonist, obviously, I think is just a fantastic lead. And the style, obviously, very unapologetic, very brash. What about some of the other characters that are not as, we don't get to know them as well, but
Mm,
we get to know their reflection through Adrian. I'm thinking of
mhm,
Leia in particular. Like,
mm.
what are some of the layers that you, as you peel back the character of Leia, you uncover?
It's sort of interesting. There are so many different approaches to writing fiction, and um, uh, sort of a term that's gained a lot of cultural momentum over the last few years is world building. And
Hmm.
world building basically refers to doing a lot of preparatory work, imagining the details of the world you're going to set your story in, such that the story itself um, like it feels grounded, and that it's everything's well thought out. So this is true in movies as well as books. So if you imagine, if you're making a big new science fiction movie, often production teams will prepare like guides and sort of background materials and
Hmm.
art and props and things that are never used on set. But it's like, this is the ecology of the planet where we're setting this
Hmm.
scene, and sort of the whole background of like the political history of it never plays a role in the story. But the people making the film find it useful to do that homework, basically,
Hmm.
because it gives them confidence in that the resulting film will feel
Hmm.
real,
Hmm.
or will feel like it's deeper than the movie itself seems
Hmm.
to just presents. And that's very true in fiction as well, particularly in fantasy or science fiction, where they're not seeking realism, right? That people do a lot of work, some writers do a lot of work thinking, what are the details of the world I'm going to set the story in, even though those details don't show up in the manuscript. But the same is true in many other, like not just in speculative fiction. Like some writers prepare big treatments on every character and their background. Where do they come from? What's their family history? And like, even though they only show up in one scene, right? But by having done that work, I think that some writers feel that they know the character better, and therefore can represent them more in a more compelling way on the page,
Hmm.
right? So that's like one way that writers approach that, like writing a story, and that is not me. So
Hmm.
so I almost do the opposite. Like for me, the only thing I care about is the actual words on the page. And I actually want my books to, in a certain sense, rather than being referential, like that they are referencing background material that I've done a lot of homework on, and that comes through to the reader, I want them to feel suggestive, that
Hmm.
I I include something that makes you imagine more of the world yourself as you're reading it than I ever have, and maybe and you
Hmm.
do it in your own way, right?
Hmm.
Because in some ways, it's like if a screenwriter writes the screenplay that a director turns into a film, a novelist writes a manuscript that the reader turns into, like puts on in the theater of their mind. And so for me, I'm always seeking for it to be suggestive. So I don't really have a lot to tell you about Leia
Hmm.
except what's in the novel. Um,
Hmm.
like I want her to feel like a real person, because, or to feel like a fully, like an emotionally deep human who like has complexities and contradictions, like absolutely. But like the only place she exists is on the page. So I'm seeking to
Hmm.
do that with the words in the manuscript, rather than having like a bunch of background material I'm not sharing
Hmm.
with the reader.
Hmm.
And that's an intentional choice. It's like a different way of looking at trying to tell stories, I guess. Does
Hmm.
that make
No, No, completely. I think I subscribe to your style of doing things too. I think of it as a well, I guess a hybrid. I mean, I don't try and flush out world building to any degree, but
Hmm.
in the choosing of the words to represent a character, it's almost as
Hmm.
if chiseling at the probability space, where
Sure.
um, right, and sort of you're trying to carve out the right amount, the right perspective for this higher dimensional thing that then you
Hmm.
map down to a character that then has a role in the
Hmm.
story and makes you
Hmm.
feel certain different things.
Hmm.
um, and I think that's sort of what I was trying to get at, because the character of Leia was really interesting to me from when we meet her, when the line goes something like, "Leia is from California. Don't hold it against her." And that's enough to, like, all right, let's unpack that for a while. How many layers are in this one? You know, uh, and so that type of stuff, which is, you're establishing the tone already by, but you're
Sure.
also connecting to the reader, and you're also, there's a lot along the way which is just from that statement of Leia is from California, and then obviously all the part that she plays throughout the story, and the relationship, the changing relationship with the characters as you go along. I think that's sort of what I was trying to get at, is like, how do you chip away at the probability space such that you're a hill climbing in the right direction, that you are, this is who she is, you know.
So let's take that line.
Mhm.
So what's interesting about that line is it tells you something about Leia, but it also tells you something about the narrator, right? About
Mhm.
the person saying, like, that's a really specific way to say something, right? Like,
Mhm.
you can already tell that they have an attitude, right? And sort of
Mhm.
the texture of that attitude from one sentence. Not only can you tell something about Leia and about the narrator from that sentence, but you can also tell something about the relationship that the narrator has with Leia, right?
Mhm.
Like all like that one. I mean, that's not even a long or complex sentence, but it already suggests so much about the story, right? About what's
Mhm.
in the story. It has all it plays many different roles. And I guess, like, you could even take it one step further if you want to break the fourth wall, where it, like, in addition to telling you about the narrator, who is the main character because it's a first person uh,
Mhm.
novel, and about Leia, and about the relationship between Leia and the main character, it also tells you about your relationship as a reader with the author, right?
Mhm.
Like, what kind of story am I in for here? Like, what is this
Mhm.
experience going to be like? And so, like, that's what I find really beautiful and fascinating about writing, is trying to get to that, right? Like, finding the
Mhm.
right voice for a character or for the story, like finding your way in. And I loved writing Adrian because of his
Mhm.
attitude, right? Like,
Mhm.
because
Great
he
fun.
yeah. So I had just a blast writing him because it was so much fun to spend time with him. Like, I like, spend time
Mhm.
in his head. I was just like, oh man, like, I can't wait to, like, just like riff on something through his lens. And that was delightful to me, and hopefully, that passes through, and some readers find it delightful as well.
Oh, certainly for this one. And I mean, and the way you stack the layers and you reveal, you slowly get to know Adrian, as the philosopher spy he becomes. Uh, I think it's just really well done. The other thing that I just have to say that you do so incredibly well is, you're a bit of a tease. As soon as you're getting, like, you make up, progress an inch, and then Adrian has a story to tell about, the time that he went somewhere.
Mhm.
Um, no, but it makes for an incredibly, like, a joyous ride, and I think I think of myself as in the beginnings of my journey, trying to, string these symbols together to create an experience for someone. But I think that
Mhm.
the way that it's done through Foundry, where you're telling these stories that are sort of stacked in the
Mhm.
like the emergence tree, or the
Mhm.
emergence ladder, where you have emergent behavior at the molecular level, and the, biological level, psychological level,
Mhm.
societal level,
Mhm.
and, historical level. um,
Mhm.
and And another part that I think is, remarkably cool and somewhat, Latin American is the magical real aspect of it, where, it really is hard to tease out where the made up parts and where the real parts are.
Mm,
Um, do you want to talk a little bit about that style of, I guess, the speculative nature of fiction, where, it is based on a world we know and based on the
mm,
science that we know and based on the zeitgeist that we know. But there are
mm,
elements where your brain takes liberties and says like, what if this is the technological fork that society takes?
mm. Yeah. So I think that one of, at the beginning of this conversation, we were talking about being here or being elsewhere, right? And that any form of sort of story, part of what it does is it takes you elsewhere. And that means that instead of your attention being in your immediate physical experience, like your sensory experience, like what can I see right now? What can I listen to? What am I tasting right now? Instead, your attention's focus is in your imagination, right? And the beauty of imagination is that, unlike the reality that you exist in physically, you can do anything in your imagination, right? I mean, you can do anything and you have an infinite budget, right? And you're even
Hmm.
less limited than a Hollywood director with a $200 million production budget, because all the
Hmm.
special effects you can do in your head. um,
Hmm.
so um, what that means for storytellers is that everything is always made up. I mean, like, fiction is fiction. Like um, a novel set in today's world about the psychological experience of getting a divorce is just as fictional as a space opera, right?
Hmm.
Or the Lord of the Rings. There really is no there's nothing different between those two. They're both completely made up stories. So really what you're doing as a writer is you're choosing what to make up, right? You're just choosing what is the kind of uh, imaginative world that you want to spend time in, that you want to invite others into. Where is your elsewhere for this story, right? Um, and um, and so I think that, from my perspective, it's mostly about uh, inventing an elsewhere that I want to explore myself, basically. I happen to be, as I mentioned before as well, like I love just like learning about the world we live in. Like, I just find that you were talking about sort of like the systems we are nested within, that we live our lives inside of, whether it's from uh, microbiology all the way up to geopolitics, right? Or anything in between. And I find that stuff fascinating. I find the world we live in endlessly fascinating. And so a lot of my stories use a lot of elements from what I am learning about the world I live in. And I think that there's probably a good analogy here to cooking. So if you imagine that you're like, I mean, you're going to cook dinner tonight, right? So you go into your kitchen, you start opening up the fridge, you open up some of your, the drawers, the cabinets, the pantry, whatever, and you see what's there. What are you going to make tonight? Like, what are you pulling out of each of those places? How are you going to combine and remix them? And so I think about stories that way. So I think, okay, this is this is what's going on with Adrian. This is what's going to happen next. Like, what's the most interesting meal I can make for the reader, right? Like, how can I take the ingredients of things that I find interesting, like the ingredients I chose to buy at the farmer's market, right? Like, there's a reason they stuck out to me. So I take those ingredients and I mix them into something particular and specific and compelling, right? And so because of that, a lot of my fiction uses a lot of, or you could call my fiction realistic, because a lot of the ingredients that I choose are things that I've learned that I'm learning about the world. Like as with Foundry as an example, like I learned a lot about the insane science and engineering behind how we make the semiconductors that are allowing us to have this conversation right now. Like it's just fascinating. It's basically I mean, you want to talk magical realism, like how they're made as magical realism. So I found that to be just so astonishing to think about as a human achievement that it was an ingredient I was excited to use, right? And then some of those ingredients, instead of being a thing I learned about the world we live in right now, are a what if question, like what if X happened, right? Because you learn things, then you wonder what might happen if this other thing went down, or what might happen in the future, or what might happen if this was a little different, or whatever. And so some of those ingredients, like adding the spices, it's like what if questions about how the world might be different than it currently is. And that, but you're still making one meal, right? You might use cardamom in many different dishes, but today you're making one meal. So rather than it being just a what if question, you actually have to come up with a specific answer to it that is woven into this world, right? That's woven into the story, and that, you know, creates the experience you're seeking to create for the reader. So that's sort of how I go about it. And then I think that again, because I always think of myself as a reader first and a writer second, one thing I love about reading speculative fiction is that speculative fiction that has that reality remixed quality to it, right? That's rather than being space opera or the Lord of the Rings, where you're just, this is fantasy, we're starting out the door, you know, like Star Wars is a good example of this, right? It's just, it's fantastical. It's like, I love the movies. They are fantasy. But one thing I really like about stories that feel like they're reality, but not everything, but certain things are changed or different, is that it feels to me a lot like travel. You know, so if you go to a new country that you've never been to before, you don't speak the language, like you have to figure out how to use the bathroom. You have to figure out like how to get the right currency. You have to figure out where to eat or whatever, and that's going to be a whole adventure. But what's most interesting is when you return home, because you return home and you start to notice things you never noticed before about home, right? The things you took for granted, the things that the other people living in the place you just visited might do differently that you never even thought were a thing, right? There, you always notice these assumptions, right? These preconceptions that you had simply because you grew up where you grew up, that you only notice by virtue of comparison by having been in another place. And as a reader, I love that with speculative fiction, that when I read it, it sort of bends my mind. But because you're in the middle of the story, you're experiencing that elsewhere. You're experiencing that world on its own terms. And then when you finish the book and you return to your own life, you might ask yourself, what assumptions am I making about how the world I live in works that are revealed by having experienced that story? So I think that's a real gift. That's something that I love as a reader about speculative fiction. It's something I seek to offer those who read my novels, where I'm trying to create I'm trying to create stories that have thought-provoking differences between the world of the story and the world you might inhabit, to give you that gift, right, of being able to maybe look at your own world through fresh eyes.
No, it's beautiful. I think that it bends your reality as you're consuming it, and I think it's incredibly powerful. What are some of the stories that made you? What are some of the highlights in your bookshelf, of the books that you've read that, put you on this path? What are some of your favorite stories or books?
Yeah, I read really widely. So let's see. What are a few that have really struck a chord with me? I love, like, Dune was a big
Mm.
story for me growing up. It's just this epic adventure, and it has a lot of those political elements. It has ecological elements.
Mm.
It's just a great story as well, right?
Mm.
Like trying to find the cleanest line, right? It's really wonderfully told. I recently read a wonderful Japanese novella in translation called uh, If Cats Disappeared from the World. And like, talk about speculative fiction. It basically, this doesn't ruin it. I think you learn this on the first page or something. But basically, the story revolves around um, a mailman who discovers he has terminal cancer, and the devil shows up in his apartment and offers to extend his life by a single day for
Mm.
everything that he chooses to remove from the world. So, as an
Mm.
example, it would be like if I told you, you will live one day longer if if you agree that we will remove coffee from the world, and if you accept
Mm.
this offer, tomorrow there has never been coffee, right? It's like the world we
Mm.
live in with no coffee ever. um,
Mm.
and it's just beautifully told. It's sort of a
Mm.
little whimsical, like thought provoking, but like, talk about speculative fiction. That's not the kind of book you would often see up on a bookshelf next to Dune. But in
No.
many ways, it does a lot of similar things for the reader, because it's the
Mm.
story, and then it's also, you can't help but wonder as you're reading the story, what if I had to be in that situation, right? Like what would it feel like what would it even mean to remove something permanently from the world? So, that was a wonderful recent
Mm.
read for me. I also I really love John McPhee's nonfiction. John McPhee was a one of the staff writers who really helped define the voice of the New Yorker. And
Mm.
he, in addition to that, he may still be, I don't know if he's still teaching, but for many decades, he taught writing at Princeton. And many of his students went on to become very influential writers. So he sort of has this like dual role
Mm.
as a teacher and as a writer. Um, but he has this wonderful novel called Orange, or sorry, not novel. It's nonfiction, about oranges, and the title is Oranges, and it's literally just about the fruit, and it just, you wouldn't think that you could write an interesting book about that, and it is just fascinating. And I'll actually mention another book of his, which is called Levels of the Game. Actually, that's where you should start. Start with Levels of
Mm.
the Game. So let me tell you about this book. It's probably only, I don't know, 100 pages, 120 pages. And it's about these uh, a tennis match between a semifinals tennis match from, I think, maybe 1968. So it's a reported story. Like, he
Mm.
watches the tennis. It's like if you just were to read about the Warriors game last night, right? Like,
Mm.
it's a reported story about the tennis match. And the obvious question is like, who cares? Like, this wasn't even like a Masters tournament. It wasn't even the final. It was the semifinal of a tennis match in the 60s. Like, what possible relevance could this have for anybody, right? Like, aside from someone curious about the score the day after who wasn't able to watch the match. But this little novel is one of the best books I've ever read about the United States. Like, if you want a master class in what we were discussing before of using story and then sort of going up and down the ladder of abstraction to think about uh, race,
Mm.
politics, cultural dynamics, economics, like sports. just any way you want to look at it. This book, as it does a beat by beat reporting of the match, uses the drama of the match to reveal like a comprehensive view of this country, of like the nation at that time. And it's just so beautifully done. Like, if you want to talk about finding a clean line through a
Mm.
story with that much complexity, boy, is that a good example. And it's nonfiction, right? So it's narrative
Mm.
nonfiction, but it's extraordinary storytelling. So yeah, I love his work.
Wow,
So those are
that's
three
awesome.
very different examples. Yeah.
Yeah, no, no, no. But that's and I think it's great because I think that there's only so much that you get out of um, trying to emulate the style of someone else through the same
Mm.
medium. But there's so much more in terms of integrating. Well, I love to read nonfiction, and I love to watch movies, and I love to play video games, and love to
Mm.
play board games, and I feel like there's elements of all of it that end up going into the work that I think are worth highlighting. I personally really love James Gleek. I don't know if you know James Gleek.
Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, the he has a book called The Information, which has absolutely
Hmm.
changed my life. And Dune is another is also very high up for me. It was written 2 blocks away from here.
Oh,
Um,
really? Oh, wow.
yeah,
Very
which is
cool.
pretty cool. And then yeah, I don't know. I mean, like it's fun to share. There's another really good book called How to Talk About Books You Haven't Read. Um,
Used by
it's
a lot of
actually
like radio interviewers.
yeah, and it's about like you're trying to figure out what the bookshelf, what
That's
somebody's,
great.
and it's an art. I mean, it really is. I mean, like
Yeah.
you know, but that's awesome. What about some of the and I just to close out, what are some of the lessons that you've learned 11 novels in?
I think one of them is about commitment. That I'll use the surfing metaphor again. If you are in the water and you're paddling for a wave, there's always this moment when the wave comes up behind you and you feel its power. It pushes you, and you see the wall of the wave start to form. There's always this moment where you almost want to pull out, right? It's a
Mm,
little scary. It's like you're accelerating, and it's vertiginous. It feels like you're falling, and um, so you almost want to pull out, and like sometimes I do, uh, but uh, the worst thing is when you like don't commit. You can't decide, right? Rather than being like, I'm not going to go for this
mhm,
one, or fully committing and dropping into the wave, where you sort of hesitate and waffle, and then everything goes wrong, right? Because you get
mm.
thrown over the falls, and you're going to be drinking a lot of seawater. Um, and so I think about that a lot when I'm writing. That um, the mind is incredibly creative in finding clever ways of convincing itself not to do the thing that needs to be done.
Mm.
Um, in exactly the same way that when you are paddling for a wave and you need to just fully commit and not just go for it and let the rest go. I find the same dynamic is very true of any creative project I've ever been a part of, where um, you just need to commit. You need to commit to the specifics of, you need to commit to that character, to their way of seeing. You need to commit to the story of what is the thing that needs to happen next. Um, and you need to cut to the chase. You need to find that clean line. You don't. It's so easy to unprofitably distract yourself, to come up, oh, maybe I should make a list of the next things I'm going to write about instead of just writing,
Mm.
right? Oh, wouldn't I be more productive if I used this system or way of
So,
thinking? Wouldn't I, etc. Right? And like all of those are ways to not do the work. And I struggle with that a lot. I struggle with that every time I sit down to write. And um, so I think that, I guess I don't know if you count that as a lesson learned, because it's maybe not helpful guidance, except for the fact that by virtue of knowing how others struggle with it, maybe you give yourself the permission to fully commit. Um,
mhm.
and I think that's like, I think there's also something profound in how that applies specifically to writing fiction. Like, before, we were talking about how it would be easy to have written an essay about the implications of something like solar geoengineering, but that it was difficult to figure out how to dramatize that in a novel. And I think that one of the beautiful things about stories is their specificity. It's about things actually happening, it's about a chain of cause and effect. It's not just an idea, it's not just an argument, it's not just a description. Um, it's not just a theory. It is all of those things embedded into an imagined story, an imagined sequence of cause and effect. And that cause and effect is specific. You can't have a story about an abstract character, or it just doesn't, that we wouldn't even call that a story, right? So
Mm.
I think that requires a really surprising amount of commitment. And this applies at every level of storytelling. Last night, my son is 9 months old, and I was uh, feeding him a bottle as he was going to bed. So it's like the room is dark, I'm feeding him his bottle, and just, I mean, he can't understand what I'm saying to him, or not very much of what I'm saying to him. But just sort of as a comforting thing, I told him a little story about like a rabbit in Joshua Tree. And so I just made up this little story as he's sitting on my lap and I'm feeding him. And I felt that vertiginous quality, even in something as, you'd say, you're not even committing to writing this down, let alone sharing it with anyone that can even understand the story. But somehow it wasn't an explanation of a concept. It was, there's this rabbit. What is going to happen to this rabbit? What does this rabbit need to deal with? So you have to then commit and say, this is what's happening. And then this happens. And then this happens. At every point, you're committing to creating a concrete, specific sequence of events. And I think that at least for me as a writer, that has a lot more, or that has like the maximum amount of whatever the noun would be for vertiginous quality. It really feels like I'm always looking over the edge of a cliff, far more
Mhm.
so than if I'm writing an email or an essay.
Mm.
And
Mm.
so maybe that's why it attracts me. Maybe that's
Mm.
why I like writing fiction, is that you're always playing with that edge and always needing to synthesize whatever your ideas are with character, with everything else, in order to create a an experience for the reader that is holistic, that's comprehensive, that feels like a world.
Mm.
So I think that's probably um, the lesson learned that's most present for me right now.
Mhm. That no, I mean, I think that's awesome and it's inspiring, and I think it's like I think this is a pervasive feeling, certainly if you're embarked in a creative project, but I think we all feel it for the parts of our ego that we don't want to pay attention to. The
True.
the extra niceness you need to tactically deploy, the thinking about what food or information you consume, thinking about how you end up spending your time in aggregate. I feel like a lot of those things, when you're embarking on a new way of eating, a new way of exercising, a new way of playing sports, a new something, you're always
Mm.
like your identity is at stake. You're staking your identity on that,
Mhm.
um, and I think it's helpful to remind people that this is a healthy exercise, and it's the most
Mhm.
uncomfortable exercise. And I think it's just a fantastic note to end on. And then the fact that I think it's always very inspiring to remember that creativity can be a positive thing for everybody, and
Mm.
not that it's reserved for people in creative roles. The creativity
Mm.
can permeate through an email. It can permeate through a greeting. It can permeate through a surprise. It can permeate through so many different ways, and that injecting that creative part of your brain that's always imagining stuff for you and
Mhm.
hijacking the parts that are unproductive of that and deploying them to add joy and wonder and mystery in the world, I think is just fantastic. Any to close out now, finally, future plans. Are you working on the next one yet?
Yes, I'm working on a new novel, and just at the very beginning stages, just figuring out what it's about and starting to play around,
Mm.
which is a lot of fun. But like you said, uh, I think it is really important to remember that uh, creativity is not just for people who call themselves artists, or are in have some other like tag. Um, it's part of being human, and I think that a lot of like any struggle that I've described over the course of this conversation, like applies to anytime you are trying to make something you're proud of for people you care about, right? Whether that's a meal or an invitation or uh, giving a toast, right? Or literally anything. I think that there are so many opportunities to like when people talk about changing the world, they always think about big picture versions of that, right? Like making a dent in the universe kind of ideas. But I think that there are so many that is a disservice to the world because there are so many tiny ways that the world could be better, right? Like we have a instant pot cooker that we just used to make curry yesterday, and I don't think that the people who designed the user interface on that thing have ever cooked with it. Like
It's impossible.
it is impossible. Like I was literally looking at YouTube videos, unable to make the damn thing work. Um, and like that's a funny example, but like those there are opportunities to do better everywhere, right? There are so many opportunities for that. Like literally just like send a text to a friend telling them you're thinking about them, right? Like that's going to improve their day. You just made the world a better place. Congratulations, right? It's probably going to improve your day too. So you're both winners. But I just think that like bringing that point of view to life can be really lovely and generous and rewarding. So I really feel that from you, even just in this conversation. The fact that you do these conversations and seek to serve your listeners, I think, is a beautiful thing. And so I hope that your listeners pay that forward.
What a way to end it. Mr. Elliot Pepper, thank you so much for your time.
It's been a pleasure.